But meanwhile, a bill, as expected, aimed at preventing the central bank from approving the sale of Israeli war bonds has been defeated in the Dáil. In the end, Sinn Féin's bill was defeated 87 votes to 75, with two independent TDs who support the government, Heneghan and Gillian Toole, both backing it. I'm still joined by committee members of the media committee, that is, Malcolm Byrne and Aengus Ó Snodaigh, and by Fionnan Sheahan. Fionnán, can you talk us through what this was about and what happened this evening?
Yeah, so it went to a vote, as is normal now, on a Wednesday night on a Sinn Féin private member's bill, which is, to say the least, quite technical. It is to do with the ratification or approval of Israeli bonds and the role that the Irish Central Bank can have in that. On one level, you could argue, look, this was at the very least symbolic. On a higher level, you could argue, no, it was actually taking a step that could start a domino effect in other countries going down this route. The government's answer came back quite clearly from Pascal Donoghue last night. He said this is contrary to EU law, and he was basically saying it's not going to have a massive effect. Nonetheless, it became part of the debate at the moment around what governments are doing to take action in relation to Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza. And as a result of that, it became not just politicised, I'd say, it became quite a emotive issue. Last night you saw a disruption in the Dáil chamber, and then tonight there was a protest in the chamber itself by TDs. And ultimately, when it went to a vote, which you kind of look at the vote and go, it wasn't going to be binding. It wasn't directly on a piece of legislation that was going to come into law. So you have to water it down a wee bit in terms of its significance. But nonetheless, to have two government-supporting TDs going overboard will lend a level of significance to it. It'll mean the vote was that bit tighter, and will just emphasise how TDs are now coming under pressure directly on this issue.
Aengus, your legal advice said otherwise, did it?
It said that the central bank kind of plays a role, which the government was denying. They said this is the way it had to be, that the EU kind of prevented us from interfering in this way. Kind of, we are of the belief, and our legal advice is that you could direct the central bank to refuse to handle kind of Israeli bonds, war bonds, because kind of all you have to do is look at what the Israeli ministers have said in relation to these bonds, that the easiest way of supporting Israel during the period of this war is to buy its bonds. And so they have politicised them. This would be a form, from our point of view, a form of sanctions against it, a form of action directed at Israel itself, and we had the legal advice which supported the action, kind of stood by the legislation. The legislation, yes, kind of Fionnan's correct. This was at second stage. It had many other stages. If the government backed it, then you could move along, but you'll be sending a message out kind of to the other European countries as well.
And that would be the main function, you think, of this, that it would send a message, rather than it having any practical effect?
Well, if it was passed kind of in full, then it would have obviously a practical effect, but it would also kind of make other countries look at kind of how Israeli bonds are being sold within their jurisdictions as well, and hopefully kind of they would take similar action, and maybe their governments would take the action rather than depending on the opposition.
Given the importance of that message, why didn't the government support it, Malcolm?
Because in terms of the government's approach, what we want to try and achieve is to ensure that we move towards an immediate ceasefire and toward long-term peace. And any measures, the government has always said, is to ensure that they are effective. So the approach that we've always taken is one that supports multilateralism, that we work with our EU partners, that we try to influence decisions at the UN. And if you look at the approach that has been successful, where, for instance, Ireland, along with Spain and Norway, recognised the state of Palestine, where we ensured at EU level, by cooperating with other member states, that pressure could be put on Israel with regard to trade. Do we want it to happen more quickly? Yes, of course we do. But it's much more important that in any decision that we take, that it actually has an impact, rather than just, and I do get the point of making symbolic gestures and so on. The difficulty in this case is that the Irish Central Bank cannot be divorced from actions of the European Central Bank. People who know that we're part of the euro. You could argue that we allowed the symbolism of this to come through, but actually I think the government's approach is the correct one, because all of the evidence is that by working at a multilateral level, we get more impact.
Yeah,
we had a debate yesterday.
But you can actually divorce the Irish Central Bank from the European Central Bank, according to the advice that Sinn Féin got. They said you're entitled, member states are legally entitled to unilaterally restrict access to financial services within their member state in limited circumstances.
And it depends on how effective it is. And I think in terms of what, Pascal Donoghue, who you got to remember is not just finance minister, but has chaired the Eurogroup, he made very clear as to what the position was in this regard. But we listened to, with Coventry people before Profit yesterday suggested Ireland should pull back from the European Union. I mean, I get, and this is a very emotive issue. And I think everybody, and when we heard statements on Gaza last week in the House, everybody is at one about the horrors of the Netanyahu regime and what it's doing. But it's far more important that the actions we take are actually effective. And I think what is also of concern is that, and just what we've seen in the Dáil over the last couple of days, is the politics of the street being introduced into the chamber. And that is something that's actually
Is this
quite
not
dangerous.
all hypocritical? Because the Occupied Territories Bill is symbolic. That's a symbolic gesture. So you're saying, listen, we're not big on symbolism. Actions have to be effective. That's all about symbolism. If we wanted it to be effective, we'd have included trade and services in the Occupied Territories Bill, but we're not going to. And this idea as well that we're kind of all acting as one of the European Union. In the next breath, you acknowledge, actually, it's just Spain and Norway with us who recognise the state of Palestine. And I don't know any other member state that's currently passing an Occupied Territories Bill. So we're well able to do solo runs when it suits us.
We can, but we are seeing moves that if you look at it, and particularly, for instance, I think in terms of the review of the EU-Israel trade agreement, the fact that it was led by the Netherlands, which, its foreign policy approach would have been very different to ours for quite some time, was significant, and us being able to impact on that. In terms of the Occupied Territories Bill, the reason why we can progress with it, because to ensure that it wouldn't face a court challenge, it wasn't the government who were holding it up. I mean, everyone would say, oh yeah, let's just introduce it, and then if it faced a court challenge, there would be a problem. Now, because of the decisions of the International Court of Justice, we can take action. And if we're going to talk about, I think it's more important that we act as one in the House. What we're seeing is, division that's being fostered by the opposition. I get annoyed in terms of the hypocrisy. I mean, Sinn Féin continues to fundraise in the United States and yet calls out the government, over engaging with, the US administration on international policy. I think what we've got to try to do is work together as political parties to ensure, in the first instance, that we achieve the necessary ceasefire, the release of the hostages, but a long-term approach to peace. And part of the argument there is Ireland has been very supportive, for instance, of the efforts of Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli Prime Minister, and Nazar al-Kidra, the former Palestinian Foreign Minister.
How, amongst government circles, in the corridors of power, as it were, how robust do cabinet ministers think the support of Barry Heneghan and Gillian Toole is?
No, Barry Heneghan is very definitely on a fragile list there now for the last
Does that
while.
make the government more fragile, or are there numbers?
No,
actually, it doesn't matter.
On votes of confidence and on issues like the budget, they will continue to.
Yeah,
support
I
the
think
government.
you hope
you're going to get people going.
Certain.
Yeah, you're going to get people going walkabout every now and again. But the more that people go walkabout, the more likely they are then to be the one who actually ends up leaving in their entirety. The advantage, I suppose, that they have with the independent group is that they are independents. Each of them can act on their own. It doesn't mean that they draw the rest of the group with them. You had two of them tonight. You didn't have the other four going offside. You didn't have any of the junior ministers either. So yeah, I think you kind of build that into the numbers at the very start. You're going to lose one or two people along the way, either for an individual vote, either for a period of time, or completely.
So no one's going to be too panicked about this.
Danny Ray didn't vote with the government on another vote tonight. But I think on votes with regard to, confidence matters, votes with regard to the budget, certainly there's been strong support from Barry Heneghan and from Gillian Toole. I think, by the way, the other vote, which was tonight, was allowing a bill from People Before Profit to go to second stage, to allow it to be debated. And a lot of government TDs found it odd that we were supporting the right to free speech of people before profit, but yet Sinn Féin wanted to stop that bill from being
You just
debated.
voted down a first stage Sinn Féin bill. So kind of
No, there was no first stage.
Not-
Bills are allowed to progress to second stage.
Not
and they're
often when
always
it's Sinn
allowed
Féin. It's
to
not.
second
Aengus,
stage.
a final word on this.
Well, kind of the two independents aren't the story. The story is Gaza. And if the Taoiseach is interested in a joint approach, then he needs to come to the opposition and approach it that way. He hasn't done that. There are many, many steps that Ireland could take, European Union could take. We haven't imposed sanctions in the way that literally overnight there was sanctions imposed against Russia. Yet what is happening in Gaza is 10 times worse probably in some ways, and that's not to equate one with the other. Both of them horrific, but it needs to stop, and we need to play our role in stopping the war in Gaza.
Very disappointed, says one viewer. With the vote on war bonds tonight, one is the impression the government tends to seek a legal reason for inaction rather than finding a legal path to take action. So, damning indictment on the text line, Malcolm.